You're listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter. This is Inspire Change.
Before I begin the actual podcast, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I work. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspire Change with Gunter. I'm your host. In the last episode of Inspire Change with Gunter, I talked about the idea of reductionism and how it has had an impact on how we view mental health conditions, whether they be psychological distress or psychological disturbances. And I want to take this a little bit further because my view fundamentally includes that we need to consider most things from a multifactorial perspective. In other words, if we purely rely on reductionism, we're going to get ourselves into serious trouble. So what's it look like outside of the whole psychological arena or the psychiatric arena for that matter? We can't, as we said in psychology and psychiatry, reduce everything to a bunch of neurochemicals or, in fact, even things like genetics. Now, in this particular podcast, I want to talk about the impacts of reductionism and patriarchal ideologies in the context of their effects on particularly men. And, we tend to talk about patriarchy, about how it affects women and potentially other minority groups. But I want us to understand how patriarchy actually has a considerable negative impact on us as men, both individually and collectively. So let me talk a little bit about the whole thing from a sociological perspective. So, the obvious one here is if we're going to take a holistic view, let's take a look at society as a whole. And so there are some very, very clear elements in our social expectations that have a massive impact on men. So let's be a bit more specific. Our society has a particular set of norms that dictate what's deemed appropriate behaviour for men. Now, these norms are influenced by patriarchal thinking, and they tend to oversimplify the complexities of individual personalities. Again, we're talking about reductionism, how it affects how we perceive men. So as a result of these expectations, men are expected to conform to certain standards of behaviour, dress, how we think, and ultimately this limits their ability to express their own humanity fully. Now, this reductionist outlook not only restricts the range of experiences available to men, but also perpetuates harmful stereotypes and reinforces gender inequality. And it also leads to a whole bunch of stuff like normative male alexithymia. That is our difficulty in expressing our emotions. So here are a couple of examples. Hypermasculinity. I've seen a massive rise in this idea that boys and men need to be strong, aggressive, and unemotional and competitive. This forces them into a mould that's not only limiting, but can also be psychologically damaging. Because what happens if you don't conform to these stereotypes? Now, one of the things that's disturbed me recently, or pissed me off to be more appropriate, is looking at a YouTube video series that talks about stoicism And the graphic representation of the Stoic is this male, either Greek or Roman, who is obviously on steroids, because you don't get that sort of muscular definition without some sort of chemical help. That's the only way to put it. It is absolutely ridiculous. So now we're matching the thinker with the Übermensch, the hypermasculine specimen who is, some sort of physical ideal that conforms to the patriarchal, competitive, and aggressive stereotype. The other area in sociology that I think needs to be looked at is the whole issue about male friendships. The problem that I see in a lot of men's relationships with each other is that, our norms discourage us from being deeply emotionally connected to other men. There's a certain often level of homophobia in that. So friendships are reduced to activities rather than emotional support. And that in itself then leads to the obvious emotional isolation that comes with it. So let me touch again once more on the impact psychologically. So if we, I'm a big one on this, and that is that we have this problem of emotional repression. But I also want to put out there is that our problems are not going to be solved by simply being emotionally expressive. In some relationships, men who are emotionally expressive can by themselves become quite narcissistic, wherein it's all about their emotions, but their partner fundamentally never gets quite a look in. Now, if I'm the partner of a man who is like that, I'd be certainly frustrated and annoyed and pissed off a lot of the time. So the idea that this lack of expression, emotional expression, is front and center in this, I think can be misleading. What we need to look at is the cultural expectation that men should avoid displaying vulnerability or sensitivity, and that we need to balance emotional expression out with rational, logical, and critical thinking. Because a lot of our behaviours socially need to be re-evaluated. Our norms need to be re-evaluated, not from a reductionist point of view, where we can sort of talk about, men are just like this because we're genetically programmed, or it's because we've got high levels of testosterone. Those things are reductionist ideas that actually have very little bearing on how we as men can express ourselves and live more fully. So the problem in the psychological domain is then that we get, very strong mental health stigmas. We get high rates of suicide, and we get relationships very quickly breaking up. Because it's not sustainable. You cannot, if you're not in a good place in your relationship with yourself, have effective, expressive and intimate relationships with others, especially your partner. I've got a special announcement about how you can work with me. Since starting this podcast, I've had a lot of inquiries from listeners asking how they can work with me on a one-to-one basis. Now, I've finally managed to free up some time to work with about 5 clients privately. Typically, we'll work together for 6 months, applying the ideas I discuss here to help you lead a fulfilled, meaningful, and happy life, and a well-rounded life. If that's something you'd be interested in, drop me an email at gunter@goodmengreat.com and we'll be in touch. So another area that we need to really take into consideration when we talk about men and men's well-being from a holistic point of view is the area of economics. Now, that's not to say that in our culture economics is the only determinant factor. As I said, if we're going to pick at this like that, we're going to lead ourselves up the garden path and come up with super simplistic solutions. But let me for a moment take a look at patriarchal influence on economics. And the one that is in particularly on the forefront for most men and ultimately women is career pressures. Okay, so as men, we often face economic pressures that are rooted in that whole patriarchal, territorial provider concept. The reductionist view that men should be the primary breadwinners can lead to a whole variety of stresses, including ultimately job dissatisfaction, work-life imbalances, and anxiety and depression. And this can lead right into the third age. So I'll give you a couple of examples, specific examples of how we see this operating at an economic level. So there's what's called the glass escalator. Men in female-dominated fields often rise quickly to leadership positions. But think about this not necessarily as a success, but fundamentally it can be a trap that pushes them into roles that they actually may not desire. You know, one of the things that I found was that in working as a psychologist, as a counselling psychologist, loved my work with clients. But I certainly did not, when I was then in the public service, enjoy the upper level management process wherein I was dealing with people who were more concerned about their careers than about the services that we were delivering or the context in which we were delivering those services. Now, the other issue that comes up constantly in this context is long working hours. You know, I talk about patriarchy and neoliberalism going hand in hand with patriarchy. And it's created a system whereby the individual is almost pitted against the collective, right? So, you know, we have this problem then of the perception that if we want to succeed, we need to work long hours because we need to be competitive. And those who don't do that are slackers, you know, the welfare types, the ones, you know, for whom, you know, they're economic leaners, you know, for that expression, abominable expression as it is. So there are a whole range of economic ideas that collide. You know, and if we only look at these in a reductionist framework, we lose the impact that this has. As you just heard, I connected a range of ideas together. So it's never, you know, one size fits all, or it's this particular variable. Okay, let me take this a little bit further then into the area of politics. Now, you know, in this particular environment, let me look at the lack of support systems. Patriarchy affects politics in ways that often overlook men's specific needs, like a better work environment, a better career path that encompasses their personal and emotional needs. So we really don't focus a lot on men's social support systems. Policies like paternity leave, for instance, generally are sparse, and those companies that have them, often individuals, don't follow through on those because they're concerned that it's still going to have an impact on their career. So embedded in it is a reflection of the perception that caregiving isn't the man's role. And I find that, you know, for a lot of men, including myself, I enjoy the process of caregiving. I love children. I love, you know, being a part of raising them right. And I want them to be able to take the lessons that they learn with me, the modelling that they get from me, into other relationships. So, you know, I've talked about the idea of paternity leave. Fundamentally in our society, it's still inadequate. We lack sufficient paternity leave policies that means then that men miss out on early bonding experience with their kids. And it perpetuates this cycle of absent fathers. And if we're going to create a healthier society, both for boys but also for girls, we need to work against this. We need to actually institute policies and procedures that allow men to be present in the early bonding experience and also then be able to support their partners and their children as we go along. The other issue here is a criminal justice system. It's a system that disproportionately incarcerates men, especially those from marginalised communities. And it serves to reinforce harmful patriarchal norms, stereotypes around masculinity and power. And all we need to do is take a long, hard look at what we see in the media, both in terms of non-fiction but also in fictional representations. So the fundamental ideological failure of patriarchy is that it creates the trap of traditional masculinity to which all things are reduced. And furthermore, in that process, all things are reduced to a biological level. Men are the way we are because this is how nature made us. And that way of thinking is completely against the evidence, the scientific evidence. It's a nonsense. So we have things like neurobabble, where we talk about all these neurochemicals in isolated reductionist language. Testosterone is the driver that makes men the way that they are. That's just not true. It's not what the science tells us. So, we need to consider that the patriarchal system doesn't just fail women. It's a flawed ideology that fails men as well, if not more so. So by imposing narrow definitions of masculinity, it traps men in cycles of emotional repression in terms of, increases in acquired narcissism. It limits our economic and social roles, and it sidelines us in political policies that affect not just our lives, but everybody else's lives very, very deeply. So we need to recognise that we need to create a more equitable framework. These are not gender specific. Our patriarchal attitudes restrict the full scope of human experience for men just as they do for women. By understanding these impacts, there is an opportunity to move towards more holistic expressions and perspectives that allow for the emotional, economic and political complexities that define the experiences of men in society. So we need to move away from this reductionist idea and begin to focus not on categories in isolation, but on the bigger picture. It is holistic. It's like the ecology. We need to think of it as an interrelating system of systems. And once we can do that effectively, we are going to be on the way to creating a much more stable humanity, a greater ecological sound perspective, and it's going to give us longevity, because right now, folks, it seems like we're heading towards extinction really, really quickly. So I wanted to give you a taste of how to look at this. Now, there's obviously some geopolitical issues going on at the moment that are of deep, deep concern. And if we keep using reductionist thinking to try and address these problems, like the Ukraine, like Israel, like Kosovo, like the Middle East as well as Africa, we're never going to come up with a sustainable process and solution that gives people the experience of a common shared humanity. Please think about this, think about it critically, think about it deeply, and until next time, this is me signing off. Love to hear from you. And if you're interested, please check out my work on www.guntersvoboda.com or www.guntersvoboda.com. goodmengreat.com.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit goodmengreat.com. For inquiries regarding broadcast topics or appearing on the show, email Miranda at noirtainment.com. That's Miranda at noirtainment.com.